You weren't wearing a seatbelt, you were sitting in the back seat, or perhaps the front seat actually. Your parents were smoking with the windows just slightly cracked, Fleetwood Mac, or the Eagles bleeding through the AM radio. And nobody was particularly worried about you. It wasn't intentional neglect, they just weren't watching closely. And something about that environment shaped you in ways you are probably still unpacking today. Individuals who spent their formative years in the 1970s bear a psychological fingerprint that runs through the generation, one that isn't always so obvious. It goes much deeper than mere nostalgia, as that word is thrown around so often, or even the familiar phrase that things were simpler back then. I mean, yes, that might be true. However, we are going to explore what that reality actually looks like. Let's begin with something that is a bit difficult to discuss, shall we? The 1970s marked the first decade where the traditional American family began visibly fracturing in real time. Divorce rates skyrocketed, essentially doubling between the 60s and 80s and eventually peaking in the mid to late 70s. This was far more than a mere statistic for millions of children. For them, it was just a regular Thursday. It was their everyday reality. Researchers who have studied what is sometimes referred to as the divorce generation have discovered that children who experienced family breakups during this era developed a highly specific worldview. Love is conditional, stability is fleeting, and adults are simply doing the best they can, even when their best isn't quite good enough. That final point matters deeply because kids raised in the 70s didn't just learn that things eventually fall apart. They became entirely accustomed to it. They learned to keep moving forward when the going gets tough and to avoid making it weird at school on Monday morning. And there is something almost tragic about exactly how functional that made you. Picture this scenario. It is 1977. You are 11 years old. Your mom is late picking you up from a friend's house. She simply forgot she is working 2 jobs now that your dad walked out 8 months ago. She doesn't apologize, mostly because you don't really expect her to. You both get into the car and stare straight ahead, and the silence between you isn't angry. It is just the shape of how things are now. You have become an absolute expert at reading the room since you were a very small child. Psychologists who looked into the emotional development in children of divorce, including Mavis Hetherington, whose 20-year study of more than 450 families remains one of the most encompassing of its kind today, discovered a pattern they termed parentification. It is essentially when kids start taking on the emotional responsibilities that normally belong to adults, largely because the adults around them were completely overwhelmed or just spread way too thin. From the outside looking in, it appears like that kid is remarkably mature for their age. But on the inside, they tend to feel rather lonely. You became highly capable very quickly, perhaps a bit too quickly. You learned to ask for much less and internalize things like the idea that your needs made other people tired. This is perhaps the part where a lot of people reading this start to feel a bit uncomfortable, because if that sounds like you have probably spent the vast majority of your adult life believing that your deep self-sufficiency is just your natural personality. However, it could just as easily be a childhood coping strategy that transformed into its own character trait, and that represents a very significant difference. But here is the fascinating thing about 70s kids that often gets completely overlooked when people discuss your generation. You were also extraordinarily free, not free in a purely romanticized way. Not the specific kind of freedom that gets turned into a Hollywood movie montage. It was real, unsupervised, figure-it-out-yourself kind of freedom. You left the house right after breakfast and only came back when the streetlights finally came on, and nobody tracked your movements. Nobody even could. There were absolutely no cell phones. There was no digital location sharing. Your parents had a rough idea of the general direction you went, and that was considered more than enough. Developmental psychologists have explored a great deal about unstructured, kid-led play, and researchers like Peter Gray have written extensively on this very important topic. Although play might not seem like a particularly serious activity, it actually teaches kids crucial, lifelong lessons. Those children who spent their childhoods in the 1970s received a massive amount of this. You worked out your own fights right there on your street, made up your own elaborate game rules, and sorted out for yourself exactly who you could trust and who you couldn't, all with no adults stepping in to mediate or control any of it. As supported by clinical research, A generation that is unusually adept at managing pure ambiguity is naturally produced by this environment. You can comfortably remain uncertain about possible future outcomes in a way that honestly trips a lot of people up today, most notably those in younger generations. It acts almost like a personal mantra. You do not need an immediate resolution right now. You have kind of been looking for that resolution your entire life, but along the way, you have become an absolute expert at waiting. There was also something else shifting in the broader culture that was seeping into your psyche, whether you fully realized it or not. The 1970s was heavily saturated with a collective disillusionment that really had no clean name. Vietnam had ended very badly. Nixon had resigned in disgrace. Economic inflation was brutal. The bright optimism of the 1960s had curdled into something far more suspicious and sardonic. And growing children absorb the emotional temperature of their specific era the exact same way they absorb a spoken language, not by directly being taught it, but by constantly swimming in it. What this cultural shift gave a lot of 70s kids was a very early, highly functional sense of irony, along with a suspicion of authority that wasn't exactly pure cynicism. It functioned more like a carefully calibrated skepticism. You did not blindly assume that institutions were inherently good. You didn't just assume the adults in charge actually knew what they were doing, mostly because the available evidence, even when filtered through a child's limited understanding, strongly suggested otherwise. The actual data behind that intuition is quite striking. Back in 1964, roughly 77% of Americans stated they trusted the government to do the right thing most of the time. By 1980, the exact year many of you were finishing up your childhood, that percentage had collapsed to just 25%, a massive 2-point drop in roughly a single generation. You certainly didn't learn this deep distrust from reading a textbook. You absorbed it directly from the air your parents breathed, the evening news playing in the adjacent room, and the heavy weight in adult conversations you weren't supposed to be listening to, but absolutely were. That is not nothing. That history actually matters. And yet, and this is what I find genuinely moving when reflecting on it, despite all of that chaos, despite the fractured homes, the benign neglect, and the heavy cultural pessimism you continuously marinated in people who grew up in the 70s, often possess some of the most fiercely loyal and quietly deep relationships of any living generation. Because when you finally love someone, you truly mean it. You did not grow up in a modern world that constantly performed superficial connection. You didn't have access to an infinite digital feed of social affirmation. When someone genuinely showed up for you, you deeply felt it, and you never forgot that feeling. The close relationships you have actively held onto, the enduring friendships from your 20s, the specific people you have kept in your life through everything, those bonds are not casual. There is a distinct gravity to your emotional attachments that comes directly from having learned early on that not everything stays forever. So, when something actually does remain, you hold on to it very carefully. Psychologist Dan McAdams has done substantial work on a concept he calls narrative identity, which is essentially the idea that we make sense of ourselves through the ongoing stories we tell about our own lives. For those individuals who grew up in conditions of instability or deep emotional complexity, this internal narrative work often tends to be much richer, more intricately layered, and far more honestly held. You are not shocked to witness contradiction in other people. Ever since childhood, you have practically been living inside a contradiction. This ultimately represents a very specific kind of wisdom rather than just an emotional wound. The kids of the 70s who learned to cycle back home all alone, who sat quietly in the back of a smoky car, who grew up in a world that felt like it was openly falling apart, yet who still managed to find something precious and worthwhile to hold securely onto. That specific person developed something that no school curriculum can teach and that no highly structured modern childhood reliably produces, an incredible tolerance for reality exactly as it is. And if you happen to recognize yourself in any of this text, if anything written here felt less like an article and more like someone finally saying out loud what you have quietly thought to yourself for decades, then you probably already know exactly what I mean. This resilience is your true, unspoken legacy.